Thank you so much for joining me, Russ. It's an honor to chat to someone who spent decades exploring this field we both love so passionately and dearly. You've spent, as I said, decades in this field exploring something that's deeply fascinating, inner experience. For those new to your work, I'm pretty sure this podcast, people are quite familiar, but for those who are not familiar, how do you define inner experience and why does it matter?
Well, I define inner experience as whatever is occurring, what I would say is before the footlights of consciousness at some particular moment. So I usually define, almost always in my work, define the moment by a beep. So I give you a beep, it sounds like beep, and I want to know what is what your bag of neurons and bones has selected as being of enough interest to be present to you, what I call directly apprehended at some particular moment, not in response to the beep, but what I call the last undisturbed moment just before the beep, which is of course not really undisturbed and it's not really the last moment, but I think what I have found, I guess, is that most people most of the time know what I'm talking about after a couple of iterations of going through that kind of a conversation. So the so what I would say is that there are a welter of things in the universe, in the immediate environment, in your past environment, and whatever that you could be interested in at the moment. But out of those, you have probably chosen one or two or a few or none to be interested in at some particular, what I would usually have as randomly selected moments.
Mm.
And inner experience is whatever it is that that you have found interesting enough to have placed before your footlights of consciousness. So that's what inner experience. Why is it important? I guess because I think since the beginning of time, it was probably the most interesting question in the world. People are asking a penny for your thoughts. Well, as soon as there were people, I suppose, and if you go back and read Gilgamesh or the very earliest writings, they're about people interested in other people's consciousness, and that's what I'm interested in. I'm no more and no less interested in it than trying to get a good answer to the question of what's in your experience at some particular moment.
Russ, it's your work touches on such deep philosophical, psychological, neuroscientific topics. What I love to do is for the audience, for myself, is to try and define concepts. If you had to think about your definition of consciousness, you mentioned that word experience and mind. How do you differentiate or define these concepts?
Well, that's either an easy question or a difficult question, depending on how you ask. I don't know what consciousness is, so I don't try to define it. I don't know what the mind is, and so I don't try to define it. I do think that there is things that are directly apprehended, and that's what I call inner experience. What causes that, I presume, other people presume, I don't really care, but other people presume is consciousness or mind or something. And that's I think that's too hard a problem for me, probably too hard a problem, maybe too hard a problem for anyone. And so what I try to do is to limit myself to what I think I can say with some confidence, which is to say I'm interested in what I call inner experience, what is directly apprehended.
Mm.
And I think anybody who is interested in consciousness or mind or whatever ought to take my work seriously or do better than me. I don't consider myself the pinnacle of this kind of thing. I've been working at it pretty hard, doing it as best I can for quite a while. But I think there might be other people that come along doing it better. If I knew of any, I would be doing it their way. But uh, but I think directly apprehended inner experience ought to be something like a building block or at least a item of consideration for someone who is interested in consciousness or mind. But I'm not being glib when I say I don't know anything about consciousness or mind. I just don't know anything about consciousness or mind, and I'm telling you that as straightforwardly as I can.
I think that's the perfect answer. It's kind of like the more understand the mind, the more you learn about it, the more ignorant you become about the fundamental essence of what this deeply fascinating experience is. And that's how I feel. The more I explore this topic, and this podcast is obviously dedicated to the mind-body problem. And while I came to this podcast with a certain view, the more I explore this with professors from different backgrounds, different thought processes, it's very difficult to give a definition. Do you find that that's been the case when you first started out? I mean, in the 1970s, you put beepers on people. Firstly, what was that like? What were you hoping to uncover at the time? And how have your views changed over time since you've done something so strange and yet so incredible?
Well, it's true. I invented a beeper in 1973, started using it in 1973. And I, at that time, was a first year graduate student, basically. I figured out how to build a beeper on the truck on the way to my graduate training in clinical psychology. And when I got there, the director of clinical training said, "What do you want to do, Russ?" And I said, "I want to randomly sample people's thoughts." And he said he didn't think that was possible, but I said, "I think I can do it." And he said, "Well, then go for it." Much to his credit, Carl Saprell was his name. Very nice guy. But so basically, I was brought up. I grew up in the behaviorist tradition, and came of age more or less at the same time as the behaviorist tradition was maybe beginning to crumble a little bit. There were cracks in the behavior. The behaviorists had been by far the leaders for quite some number of decades by that time. But there was dissatisfaction because most people, many people, including me, thought that behavior was important, but it wasn't the only thing. What people were thinking was important. And at that time, in the 70s, I was well, let's put it this way. In my version of the history, the behaviorist tradition cracked in the direction of the cognitive tradition. And so I was there at the beginning and contributed to those cracks, I would say. And the cognitive tradition was primarily interested in thinking, and so my original work was mostly about thinking. So I asked people about their thoughts. I gave people a beeper. What made me different from other folks is I gave people a beeper and a questionnaire, so that if you had a pad of paper, which was a bunch of Likert scales, questionnaire scales, and you were supposed to respond to those about your thoughts, or thoughts about the past or the present, and about sex or about whatever. And then I analyzed those in the way that people analyze questionnaires. So I factor analyzed and whatever. And very soon I discovered that I didn't know what it really meant when some subject was saying a 3 on some Likert scale about whether this is about sex or not. And I didn't know what that meant. And so I started to ask people, well, you called this a 3. Why did you do that? And so we started having conversations about that. And they didn't know why they put a 3 on there. And I didn't know why they put a 3 on there. And so I came fairly early in my career, very early in my career, to say science can't be built on that. A science that's going to last can't start on observations that nobody knows what the fuck they're talking about. And it was so I started asking people, try to tell me about something that they knew what they were talking about. And very soon, with like 5 years maybe, I thought, well, so I abandoned questionnaires pretty early on. By the time the 70s had ended, I was pretty sure that questionnaires about inner experience couldn't do it. And I had decided that thinking was not necessarily the most important thing, because when I started asking people about what was important to them, it turned what was going on with them when the beeper beeped, which is what my interest was. They were telling me about things that were not necessarily cognitive. So the cognitive became one thing that they might be interested in, but they were also interested in feelings and sensations and whatever. And I became interested in that. So I had a beeper, which I thought was a good idea. I had a questionnaire, which I thought was a bad idea. I had interviews, which I thought were a pretty good idea. And then the question became, well, what to do with that? So I started to read literature that was available that seemed sort of relevant to this stuff, which would have been the phenomenology literature and the cognitive science literature and the memory literature and the eyewitness testimony literature and Buddhism and Christianity and Jainism and people who were trying to take consciousness or whatever seriously. And out of that came the descriptive experience sampling by about 1980. And it's changed a little bit over the years since 1980, not very much, but I think I've gotten better at it over the years. But the thrust of it was pretty much set for me, and which was basically it was worth it, I thought in 1980 and still think, to try to get somebody to tell me in a way that I found believable what was occurring already in their consciousness, whatever that was, and which I prefer to call inner experience, whatever they were directly apprehending just before they were disturbed by the beep.
Russ,
So now I've forgotten what your original question was, but that was what I was trying to answer.
Your answer perfectly lays out so many things I want to dissect and discuss moving forward. One being, you mentioned behaviorism as a huge fundamental shift in philosophy and science. And at some point, while it grew and peaked and then obviously sank at some point, you often defend B.F. Skinner as being misunderstood. You know exactly what he meant when he said certain things within the field of behaviorism. I know that you met him once and you had one encounter with him. What was that like? What was that experience like? And just for all of those who are not familiar with B.F. Skinner's work, maybe perhaps you could describe what his thesis was, how yours perhaps differs from it, and why people interpret B.F. Skinner's work incorrectly.
That is a very difficult question. I only ever met him once, and it was not an important deal for him, I'm sure. It was in a crowded room, and I was one of several people that he met at that time. I did have spent some time with some people who were his disciples, and what he said was that the world before him. So we're talking about the 1950s, maybe 40s or 50s. Before him, the world was interested in mental events and habits and things. And he said, and I think entirely correctly, so what I'm going to say about Skinner right now, I totally agree with. What he said was the world of philosophy and psychology was built on what he would call mentalisms, which was the people gave mental existing in the mind or consciousness or something credit for causing behavior. And so people would do things like measure habit strength or memory strength or whatever. And Skinner thought that was a mistake because it turns out when you try to measure habits or even things like hunger, that turns out to be a very difficult thing to do. But the philosophical and psychological world at that time was trying to do that. And so it would say things like, I eat because I'm hungry. And hunger would be what Skinner would call a mentalism. But then people would use that as an explanation for why they eat. Well, I'm eating because I got this hunger stuff. And so people would try to measure hunger. Well, that turns out to be a very difficult thing to do. Even in a rat, for example, when you try to measure hunger in a rat, you can do that by the number of hours or days or whatever since you've allowed him to eat, or the amount of quinine that you can put in his food before he'll stop eating it, or the amount of shock that he will endure to walk across a grid to get to something to eat, or a variety of other kinds of things. And they don't correlate very well with each other. And even if they did, well, I guess I don't have to say that because they don't. So Skinner came to believe that you just shouldn't credit mentalistic events. And I think he's 100% correct about that. And so his solution was to say, well, then we should just look at directly observable behaviors, and we should count them, and we should observe them. And then we can say, well, the behaviors that occur, and Skinner said, the behaviors that occur at high frequencies are ones which have been followed by things which are reinforcement. But and this is where Skinner and I sort of part ways. I think he was sort of partially right about that, but but he said, and his version of the world was what he called radical behaviorism, and by radical he meant radically eliminating mentalisms. So radical is the same way as you would say about a radical surgery. Radical mastectomy is to remove the whole thing, to remove everything. So that's, he didn't mean radical as being like revolutionary. He meant radical as being complete. So his version of radical behaviorism was to say, let's stick with what we can observe. That's so. He is given credit, Skinner is given credit as saying, well, he didn't think that mental life existed. And that is not true. That, I think, is not what Skinner thought. Skinner understood that there were things would happen. When you touched a hot stove, there was pain that occurred, and that was, I don't see your pain when you touch a hot stove. I don't see your pain. I see you recoil from the stove or whatever. But so Skinner understood that experience existed. He just didn't think it was easy to measure. And so I came along a generation after Skinner and said, well, Skinner was right about mentalisms. You can't do mentalisms, but he was overly zealous, I would think, about eliminating inner experience, because inner experience, as I came to define it, I think is as directly as apprehended as external behavior, in the sense that someone is seeing it. So when I see you recoil from the stove, that I am experiencing your recoil, and I'm counting it, and I can say, well, stove was a punishing event for whatever. But it comes down to an observation, which is basically a private event. And what I call inner experience is a private event, but it's I think, as directly apprehended as your stove recoil. I am directly apprehending that. So my job, as I saw it in 1980 and still do, basically, is to say, well, Skinner was right. We shouldn't try to credit things that we can't directly apprehend. But he was overly zealous in saying, well, we should then just eliminate all inner experience from our science. And so the question is, well, what do you do about that? And my answer to that, there might very well be better answers, but my answer is, well, we should accept that inner experience is directly apprehended. We should try to make that more public, more accessible, even though it's fundamentally private. So I'm 100% in agreement with Skinner, except and Skinner was quite clear, but he doesn't get enough credit for it. He was quite clear that inner experience existed, but they're private.
Russ, you mentioned descriptive experience sampling, and that's one of the deep foundations of your work. For anyone not familiar with it, could you explain how DES, or deep experience sampling, descriptive experience sampling, works from the beeper signal to interview process in a way that's clear for most listeners who are either familiar or not familiar with your work? And for anyone who is familiar, could you perhaps take it further for them?
So let me grab a beeper.
Oh, this is perfect. I've actually been, I was hoping you'd do something like this.
So I have a beeper. This is the beeper that I've used. I probably still have, this is the original beeper. This is the beeper from 1973. And this is the beeper from 2000 maybe, and I've been using this beeper. And this is the beeper that I have a patent on. This is a beeper that uses a little computer. This has a little computer inside it. But basically, this beeper is nothing more than basically a random interval generator. And you turn it on, and it delivers a beep, which you probably can't hear because Zoom filters it out. But let's see whether you can hear a beep. Did you hear anything? No. So Zoom is very aggressive about that and effective, and so I can't argue against Zoom for that. But there's a beep, and it goes, and it's a 700 hertz signal, which sounds like beep. And it go and the moment that I am interested in is the moment that's right before that beep. So if I were to draw time going like this, here's time going as the thing beeps, and the thing continues to beep until you stop the beep. So you push the button on the top of the beeper to stop the beep, and time continues to march along like that. So this is time going in this direction. The moment that I'm interested in is this one right there. I sometimes say 1 microsecond just before the beep occurs. It's not really a microsecond. Sometimes I say it's a millisecond. It's not really a millisecond either. Sometimes I say it's the last undisturbed moment. It's not really undisturbed. But but this is the moment that I'm interested in. I want us to focus in on what was happening just before the beep interrupted your environment. So I give you a beeper, send you out into the natural environment, in your natural environment, doing whatever it is that you would normally do, because that is what I think is interesting. I'm not particularly interested in what you do in a laboratory when I'm setting you up to do artificial stuff, but I send you into your natural environment. The thing beeps. You write down in a notebook. It's a little 3x5 regular little notebook. You jot down some notes about that. You can put them in your phone if you prefer. I think the notes are better, but different people do it different way. I don't really care. And then we'll get you get a half a dozen of those samples. You get a half a dozen notes in your notebook, and then we get together and talk about that. And we do that in what I call an expositional interview. And the expositional interview is basically I say to you, well, what was going on, Tevin, in the first beep? What was it? What did you directly apprehend at the first beep? And then we have a conversation about that, in which that's the only question that I'm interested in, but I'll ask follow-up questions to try to get you to tell me what was in your inner experience. And you're probably not going to be very good at it. And so you tell me about a lot of stuff that's not at the moment of the beep and that's not in your experience. So you'll tell me what was happening before the beep and what was happening after the beep. I was startled by the beep. Well, that's obviously after the moment that I'm interested in. And you'll tell me about things that you always do rather than things that were happening right then, and things that you want me to hear instead of what was actually going on. And you'll tell me about all kinds of stuff that's not directly apprehended. And I will point that out to you. And I would say, Tev, you're not telling me about what I'm asking about. I'm really interested in what was actually going on with you. And my art is to be confrontational like that. So I will be very confrontational about it. I say, that's not experience. But the art of it is to be confrontational and have you recognize that I'm on your side in this regard. I'm not being critical of you because I will tell you nobody is any good at it on the first day. And I'm not very good at asking questions about your experience on the first day either, because I don't know what your experience is going to be like. So we have to learn together how to do this, which I call the iterative process, that we're going to get better at it as we go.
Yeah. Russ, so sorry, I cut you off there. This was back in the 1970s. One of the questions I thought about many years ago when I saw this work come out was, as a young, let's say, up and comer, what actually made you think that this would work? Because obviously, when people grow up in certain philosophical views, particularly someone who's a fan of B.F. Skinner, you have a certain behaviorist outlook on life. At what point did you think that these idiosyncratic, detailed descriptions, rather than these broader generalizations, would give us these fine-grained details about someone's inner experience?
I don't know the answer to that. I think I'll tell you some stories, and you can speculate as well as I can about that. I was trained as an engineer. I have a master's degree in engineering, and so I have an appreciation for knowing what I'm doing. That's what engineers are trying to do. They're trying to build a bridge that actually doesn't fall into the lake, and I was an aeronautical engineer. So you want to build airplanes that actually do fly. So you take seriously what you know and what you don't know, and how much you know, so that you can sleep, because people are going to be on your airplane, and you want to be able to sleep with the knowledge that they're going to be able to take off and land without incident. So I exist clearly in the real world, and I after I worked as an engineer for a while, I decided I wanted to really be a trumpet player, a classical trumpet player, and so that was Vietnam time, and I was working as an aeronautical engineer for a company that built nuclear weapons. That was keeping me out of the army, basically. But if I wanted to be a trumpet player, then I didn't have much choice in the matter except to join the army. So I joined the army and auditioned for the United States Army Band, which is the official what they call the special band of in the United States Army, and it's stationed in Fort Myer, Virginia, which is adjacent to Arlington Cemetery, which is right across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. So basically, I spent 3 years in the environs of Washington, and my job, much of it became playing taps in Arlington Cemetery for people who were killed in Vietnam. And that job involved sitting in my car in the cemetery waiting for a funeral to arrive. So I'd drive to where the funeral was going to be, and then I'd wait, and the funeral would arrive, and I would get out of my car and play taps and get back in my car and drive to the next place and wait there. So I spent a lot of time waiting in my car. And I went to the Arlington County Library and put an armload of books in my car to give me something to do while I waited. And the books were everything that a engineer doesn't get a chance to read, which would have been history and literature and philosophy and psychology and sociology and mathematics, pure math and whatever. And eventually I discovered that I had read the entire psychology collection. So I had read all the original sources in psychology as curated by the Arlington County Library. And so I'm still trying to answer your question, I think. But what I found was that the books in psychology started out by saying, I'm going to tell you something really interesting about people. And then I'd read the book and I'd get to the end and I'd say, well, I didn't learn anything that was really interesting about people. I learned some theory about it. That was not good enough for me. So I developed an appreciation for really wanting to know about individual people. I wanted some access to something that I thought was real. That's my engineering bent, I suppose, and my musical bent, I suppose, is I have an appreciation for the way things sound and look and whatever. And then I went back to Sandia, where I worked for a while and worked as a computer person and as an aeronautical engineer at the department. And one of my jobs there was to maintain the computers, which at that time were big things. This was the 70s, and they gave me a version of BASIC. I don't know whether you know anything about computers, but BASIC was sort of the first language for operating systems of computers. And they gave me this, and the problem was that the engineers were using these computers to turn on switches and make readings and whatever. And when something got to a particular temperature, then they were going to flip this switch. And when something else happened, they were going to flip that other switch. And the computers wouldn't keep up because BASIC was slow. And so they said to me, basically, you make BASIC run faster. And they gave me the source code of digital equipment BASIC and said, this is not fast enough. And so what do you do about that? And what I did about that was I hooked up an external clock to the computer, and I put that clock in these guys' laboratories, and I said, run your experiments, do whatever it is that you do. And this clock every now and then is going to emit a signal. And when it emits a signal, it's going to keep track of what instruction your computer is operating. And run that for a while, and then it's going to store it on a floppy disk at that time, and bring that floppy disk back to me, and then I'll try to figure out what's going on. And well, it turned out that was very successful because it pointed out where the bottleneck was in digital equipment's BASIC, and I could speed up BASIC by a factor of 10 by improving the way that it was just a little section of code. It was only like 100 lines worth of code, but it went to that little section all the time. And so I became a proponent of random sampling, which, I was an engineer. I knew about random sampling. I knew about all that stuff. But it was obvious to me that this was a very complicated thing that this computer was doing. There was no way that I was going to be able to figure it out. But random sampling was the key to that.
Russ,
So
sorry, continue.
you mix all that stuff together, and that's and the readings in philosophy and psychology and cognitive psychology and behaviorism, whatever, and out of that comes descriptive experience sampling.
Russ, with DES or descriptive experience sampling, some might argue, let's say, that if you take or if you ask people about their thoughts, isn't it too subjective? Let's say you're trying to critically analyze someone's thoughts, whether it's random, whether it's not. How objective is this, or is it too subjective? How do you generally respond?
Well, if you ask somebody about their thoughts, then I would be absolutely as critical as you might be about that, because that's a mentalistic question. You're presuming that there are thoughts that are going on, and ask somebody to tell you about them. And people being nice guys and cooperative and whatever, they will tell you about that. And the answer that they give you is mostly baloney, because you've asked about a mentalism, and they've given you a mentalistic explanation, which makes sense to them, but it probably doesn't have anything to do with anything really. And I'm just parroting Skinner there, assenting to what Skinner had to say. So that's not a question that is worthy of being asked. The question, it's a different question to ask: what was going on? What, if anything, was going on in your experience at some particular moment? That I want to know what you are directly apprehending. I don't want to know about your thoughts. I don't know about thoughts. You don't know about thoughts. Nobody knows about thoughts. There are a lot of people who write a lot of crap about thoughts, but nobody knows what they're really talking about. I don't think. They have some theories about them, which a lot of people confuse as being about things that were actually happening in some mind somewhere, which maybe they are. I don't know anything about it. I don't think they do either. But they criticize me for the questions that they ask, which is not the questions that I ask. The question that I ask is the same question over and over again. What do you directly apprehend as being ongoing before the footlights of your consciousness, whatever that means, but directly apprehended? That's a synonym for before the footlights of your consciousness for me, at a particular moment. And that is not, tell me about your thoughts. That is about whatever it is that you happen to be apprehending. If that's a thought, well, then tell me about a thought. If it's a feeling, tell me about a feeling. If it's a sensation, tell me about that. Whatever it is that is directly apprehended, then tell me.
So Russ, it's the 1970s. You create these beepers, such a groundbreaking thought experiment, and then you apply this practically. What have been the most surprising or counterintuitive findings from DES?
So you broke up a little bit. What was the end of that sentence? What has been surprising?
Sorry, Russ. I was saying that it's the 1970s. You make this beeper. You start to experiment with people, and DES reveals certain things about experience. What have been the most surprising or counterintuitive findings of your descriptive experience sampling?
Okay. So I think the answer to that is almost everything. And by almost everything, I mean that with not a hint of irony. When I started out, I was interested in thoughts. I would have asked the question, tell me about your thoughts. And when people started telling me about they were telling me about stuff that weren't thoughts. So that was surprising. And whenever, and I would say, and this is an absolutely true, not ironic statement, whenever I feel like I know what I'm talking about, I'm generally demonstrated to be wrong by the next guy that I sample with. And I've had to cultivate that over the years, that when a feeling arises in me, like I know what I'm talking about, I know I'm in deep trouble. because I'm not going to hear anything. I'm not going to hear what you are going to tell me about your inner experience anymore. I'm going to hear what confirms my theory. So I would say a big part of my art, if you want to call it that, my big part of my art is recognizing when that feeling of I know what I'm talking about arises and then working against that. I'd say that's a very big part of what I do. But almost everything is surprising. Some surprises are bigger than others, but
Well, one of the things was you found that inner experience, for example, occurs less often than many people assume. Now, what does that actually tell us about how the human mind actually works?
so that's not true. What you just said is not a characterization of my work, because what I have found, what I took you to say was that inner experience occurs less frequently than people think. That's
Oh,
not
sorry,
true.
I meant inner speech.
That I would agree with.
Yes, yeah. No, that's a
But
mistake. Inner speech.
okay, that's what I thought you meant. But I want to ask, I want to answer your first question too, because it's actually an interesting question, probably more interesting than the inner speech question. But inner experience does occur. Most people, most of the time, have something going on, and what's going on is their own creation. It is not. It is not just simply what's fallen on their retina or fallen on their stirrups and anvil or whatever their apparatus is. They're they have created something, and it is there in front of the footlights of consciousness. And that's true for most people most of the time. There are some exceptions about that. There are some people who have basically nothing going on in their inner experience, and they're totally successful people, but they're the exception rather than the rule. Most people have something going on, and that is a fundamentally interesting thing. And the thing that they have going on is their own creation. That's also fundamentally important for me.
Mm.
And by their own creation, I don't mean that they sit down and say, well, I think I'll create something and then I'm going to view it. What I mean is they're they're they are choosing what is of interest to them out of the welter of things that are possibly out there. They're paying attention to this and not to that other thing, which is why I call it inner experience. So, but your question was about the people don't have a lot of inner speech. The remarkable thing about that is that everybody thinks they do have inner speech. And the question is, well, why is it that everybody thinks they do have inner speech? And one possible answer to that would be, well, because everybody does have inner speech. But that turns out not to be true. It turns out that my research, I think, pretty robustly shows that some people, a few people, do have inner speech a lot. And a lot of people have inner speech occasionally, and some people have inner speech almost never. And so if you take all of the samples that I've collected in my non-random 500 or 1,000-ish people that I've sampled with, maybe a quarter of the samples include inner speech. And that is because, so if your question is why do people think that they have inner speech a lot? I think there's two reasons for that, or there are many reasons, but two that I will tell you. Maybe I'll tell you more. One one is when you pose the question to yourself, what I call the armchair introspection question, what's going on in my experience now? That generally starts as a verbal question, what's going on in my experience now, unquote, which puts you into a verbal whatever. It puts you into the verbal realm,
Mm. So almost
verbal
like
mind.
a linguistic experience. Sort of
Yeah,
changes the way or the part of the brain you're kind of using.
that I don't know too much about, but yes, what it does, it awakens whatever part of the brain is required to do verbal stuff. It does that. I don't know what that part of the brain is, but it puts you into a verbal mode. And then you ask, well, what's going on in my inner experience? And what you find is you're in a verbal mode. So more or
Mm.
less, whenever you ask that question, you're in a verbal mode. But that's the refrigerator light phenomenon. You're only looking inside the refrigerator when the door's open, and you're only looking inside inside your mind, whatever that is, when it occurs to you to look inside your mind. So that's why the randomness of the beeper is an important deal. I don't want you to be looking inside your mind when you think about looking inside your mind. I want you to be looking inside your mind at times that are chosen by something other than your mind, like the beeper.
Yeah. I think it's one of those things where I look back at philosophy and science when we look at humans and how I would say we use heuristic adaptations, we have very limited processing powers, and when we experience reality, we often find these shortcuts or ways to interact with reality in a way that's effective. And in a sense, to assume that we all have this narrative or this inner monologue that's always ongoing, it's kind of easier because everyone else sort of does it. It's one of these consensus reality things. When you figure this out, or when you sort of notice that people lack this inner speech, how much of a shock was that to you? Or did you already have this preconceived idea that this is something that would happen?
Well, if you're talking about my personal history, I would say, as best I can reflect on it 50 years later, I expected to find a lot of inner speech.
Ah,
I thought, like everybody else did, that thinking was in words. And I was interested in thinking, and therefore I thought I was going to find words.
mm,
But what I found for my satisfaction was that it wasn't thinking that was actually going on. And so that was, I guess, the first surprise. It wasn't just the words weren't there. It was that thinking in general wasn't there. I'm paying attention to the colors or the feelings or something else. So by the time I was actually focused on words, which I never really have, my work has never actually been focused particularly on words. I've always been focused on whatever it is that's before the footlights of your consciousness. I'm known, I guess, because the popular culture thinks that words are super important, and I've said fairly consistently over a lot of years that that's not the case, and so I get credit for being a word inner speech guy, but it's not really true.
yeah, it's almost like the words do require so many more conscious efforts post production. Almost, it's kind of like you want to catch something in the spot. That's a lot further in.
Well, so the kinds of things that are surprising, if you're interested in words, what I would say is that if you start to look carefully at words, this is the phenomenon that you're going to find. You're going to find that most of the time words occur in complete sentences. There's a theory. There are theorists out there about inner speech that, following Vygotsky, who thought that all inner speech was going to be condensed, and you didn't really need to have the whole subject and the predicate because you knew what you were talking about, so you didn't really need the subject. So Vygotsky thought that inner speech was going to be predicated, just the predicate without the subject. And that turns out not to be true for most people. For some people it is, but for most people it's a complete sentence. And it turns out, so if you really are going to be interested in what passes for inner speech, these are the kinds of things that you have to take into consideration. Is it a complete sentence or not? It could be one way or the other. Is it really the experience of speaking or the experience of hearing, which turns out to be very different things, just as different as when you speak into a tape recorder and when you hear your voice play back? Those are two very different things experientially. There's no way that you would be in a position to say, well, am I saying that or am I hearing that coming back to me? Then those are very different, and they're very different in inner experience as well. Philosophical types often refer to inner speech as a auditory phenomenon, as if it was really inner hearing, which most of the time it's not. Most of the time it's more like speaking than it is like hearing, I think. So, you can always
For
argue
me,
with what I think about it, and I want to give you the opinion. I want to give you a characterization of the richness of this phenomenon. Sometimes there are words missing, and they can be the most important words. So you can speak a complete sentence without one particular word in it. or several different words in it. Or you can speak without having any words. You can have the experience of speaking with no words at all. I'm speaking them. Sometimes there'll be a rhythm to it. Sometimes I experience myself as speaking, but I don't experience the words that I'm speaking. Sometimes people will experience the words as having a physical location. Sometimes it's in their head. Sometimes it's in the back of their head. The expression, I was thinking it in the back of my mind. For some people, it is absolutely meant literally. For other people, it's entirely metaphorical because the metaphor has come to be the predominant way that that's understood. I'm not really interested in that, but I'm thinking about it in the back of my mind. For some people, it's actually there. I've written about one woman who had sentences that divided up. The first couple of words in the sentence would be in the back of the head, and the next word would be in the front of the head, and the next word would be in the back of the head, and back and forth like that.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can speak in your own voice, and sometimes you can speak in Barbra Streisand's voice.
I think that's one of the most fascinating things about studying the human experience. I often say that to not consider atypical phenomenon or pathological states of mind, you often make a very misinformed opinion on what reality is for human beings or the human experience. And my work in psychiatry, when I used to work in psychiatry, I often found that when you study the atypical mind, you have so much more access to various states of mind. And I know for you, for example, studying patients like the ones you just mentioned, or someone with schizophrenia, maybe a borderline personality, when you look at these patients, because for me, it makes a lot of sense that someone would not have an inner speech or an inner dialogue, because I've interacted with patients who have said that to me. Maybe they weren't as accurate as I hoped, but when that first happened to you, what did that feel like? Was it a very strange moment to have this random statistic that, okay, most people we expect to talk to themselves or experience this feeling of having an inner speech just don't have it? Was it very shocking to you, or was it just a normal walk in the park type of thing?
So, I want to push back on the premise of your question first, and that is that all of those things that I listed, that's normal experience. This is not
Yeah, yeah.
this is not
Not
inpatients.
a
This is people that you're going to run across when you walk from here to the grocery store. You're going to run across people who have those
yeah.
characteristics that I now people who have disturbed inner experience have a lot of other kinds of characteristics as well, and 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 they're all fascinating. But for me personally, they're not that much more fascinating than the everyday non-pathological. They're So I think inner experience is of vital importance in understanding psychopathology.
Mm.
I don't think psychological science, psychiatry understands inner experience very well. And if they did, they'd have a better idea about psychopathology, I think. And it might be very, very different from what it is that we do now. We divide people up into this is the depressed camp, and this is the anxiety camp, and this is the bulimia and neurosis camp, or whatever. We we get into the diagnostic categories based on mostly externally observable things. My guess is that it might be more productive if we had a real science of inner experience, which we don't, from my point of view. But if we did, we divide people up into different categories, or we would probably even abandon categories altogether and try to
It's kind
focus
of
on.
disappointing because we know that we use certain classification systems like the DSM, the ICD. We go through all these processes, and yet there's so much data, like the work you've done and many others, with that sort of show that human experience is so diverse, with so much variation and difference, that to actually box certain experiences is such a flaw. And yet we always do it. Does that still surprise you?
It doesn't surprise me. It disappoints me greatly,
Yeah.
but it doesn't surprise me.
Mm.
It is. Well, if you want to know what really surprises me about the whole thing is that there aren't just a whole lot of people doing what it is that I do or better. When I wrote my first book, which was in 1990, my first book about inner experience, which was in 1990, I thought I had just put myself out of a job. I thought, I told people what it is that you could have a beeper and you could pay attention to inner experience, and everybody was going to do that, and nobody was going to care about what I thought anymore. Which just turned out to be absolutely not true. Nobody has really paid much attention to any of that stuff for the largely speaking, and and that is fundamentally surprising to me. I it amazes me.
Mm.
A drug company, for example, making psychotropic medications for anxiety, depression, or whatever. I would have thought those guys would be lined up outside my door saying, I'm going to make Prozac here and I want to know what happens to Prozac. Can you talk to some people who were before they took Prozac and after they took Prozac and tell me what happened in their inner experience? It amazes me that I don't get those requests, but I don't.
And,
And so that the explanation of why that is either there's only two possibilities. One is that Hurlburt's crazy, which is fine. Take that as a possibility, that he's just wrong about most everything. I think that's possible. I don't think that's true, but I have the capability of delusion as much as anybody else does. So, but that's possible. Or that there are forces in the social world or the economic world or the whatever other world that says, well, you just can't do what it is that Hurlburt says that you got to do.
and then, Russ, have you noticed that certain DES or inner speech monologues exist more in others and less in other subtypes?
So mostly I don't know the answer to that question. The one and it exposes the weakness of the work that I have done. So I have not done anywhere near enough cross-cultural stuff. I think that would be totally interesting to see whether a person who speaks Chinese and a person who speaks English has the same processes. A person who has not been exposed to the Western civilization in the jungles of wherever, what their inner experience was like. I think that would be totally interesting. Absolutely, totally interesting. If I had another life to live, I'd probably start that way. But it's difficult. In my defense, it's difficult because the DES is not a trivially easy thing to do. You got to be paying attention pretty carefully to what people say and how they say it and what they don't say. And so you got to know the culture and you got to know the language and you got to be willing to hear and willing and able to hear what people are saying and not saying. And so to the thought of doing DES through translation is a little bit scary to me.
Mm.
And
the reason why I asked that question, Russ, is I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but I'm a huge fan of magic, illusions, tricks of the mind, and something I always found fascinating was, well, visual illusions, for an example. When you take a psychiatric patient with schizophrenia, and I'm not trying to say that these experiences have to be psychiatric or mental illness, but the human experience is so diverse, as we just discussed, that it's quite cool that certain patients who have psychosis, let's say, and are currently acutely psychotic, they don't fall for certain visual illusions, which is quite interesting. So if you take the checkerboard illusion and you put a psychiatric patient there, they don't see the difference in shades of gray that the average human would see. And so if you take that in a philosophical way, you can almost say that they have a better understanding of the veridical nature of reality than we do. So it's a fascinating question in the sense that not only does cultural diversity or neurodiversity play a role in how we perceive reality, but reality in itself is very much subjective. And whenever someone thinks they're seeing a veridical truth, that's still always up for debate because no one technically does. Is that something you ever think about? Or
absolutely. So I agree with almost everything that you said, except possibly that people who are seriously disturbed see things more accurately. I think that might be true in a pretty narrow sense. So the way I conceptualize that is I think that most people, most perception, let's put it this way. If you ask a perceptual psychologist, they would say, since the Gestalt psychologists of the 1910s or whatever and onwards would say that people have a figure in the ground. That the figure ground phenomenon is the fundamental perceptual deal, and the figure is a sort of a coherent thing that's usually in the center of the visual field if we're talking about vision, and what's in the ground is around that usually, and it's not usually seen as distinct. And if there's a border between the visual the figure and the ground, the border belongs to the figure and doesn't belong to the ground and whatever. All that stuff has been known since Wertheimer, you know. And and I have written about people who do not have a figure ground phenomenon, and they're pretty seriously disturbed. And 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 I think that's a fundamental observation. And and the and what that allows them to do is to see like 10 or 20 different things going on at the same time, because the
Mm.
figure ground phenomenon is basically to take the whole welter of perception, make one thing, figure out what that one thing is, and put everything else back into the background. That and I think that sort of healthy everyday people do that kind of thing a lot. And so you pay attention to my voice, and then you pay attention to the book that's on my over my shoulder, and then you pay attention to the itch that's on the neck that you just scratched, and then you pay attention to that, and your experience goes all over the place. And each time you're making something in the figure, and everything else is going to the ground. So when you pay attention to your itch, you destroy Hurlburt, and when you look paying attention to Hurlburt, then the itch doesn't matter. And then when the itch then comes back, and then Hurlburt, then you destroy Hurlburt. And so all this time I'm creating this and destroying that. That's normal human perception. But in abnormality, I think that breaks down or doesn't happen. And so I've sampled with some schizophrenic individuals. My first book is actually about schizophrenia in a way. It's about more about whether you should do sampling, but it involved some schizophrenia people. And their visual environment is not the way I just described it. So their visual environment bends around to some degree, or they splatter. There's like the visual experience is splattered and things splattered on it. So let me diverge back away from this. So most people, including most philosophers, I think about the visual experience as, and at least inner experience and maybe external experience as well, as seeing an image. I think that's I think that's bad way to think about the world, because it's a Cartesian view, and it says that the mind, whatever that is, creates an image, and then some other part of the mind creates a viewer of that image, and then you got these two things going on there. And I think that's probably baloney. I don't really know, but I think most people don't see an image, and in their when they see something in their inner world that is not out there in the real world, they're not seeing an image of it; they're just seeing it. So if you see a castle in Spain, it's not like you're seeing an image of a castle in Spain. You're seeing a castle in Spain, and the castle in Spain doesn't happen to be there. So I think you should talk about it as innerly seeing rather than seeing an image. But if you talk to a schizophrenic individual, it makes sense to say that they see an image, because they don't see a castle in Spain. They see an image of a castle in Spain, which has borders to it, and they can see the image curl around, and they can see the image float away. And when I was talking about the spattering, which is what brought me to tell you this story, they would say that they see black crap that's on the image. And the image might be of the castle in Spain, but the black crap would be some on the castle and some on the trees that are around the castle and some dripping off the side of the image and whatever. It's they see an image.
Mm.
And when they see you, they don't see you. They don't have a perception of seeing you. They have a perception of seeing an image of you. And you in the image, instead of having a tan shirt, it might have a red shirt in their image of you, because they are in fact seeing an image of you. And that image might be like ripped in half. And when they rip it in half, it might rip right down the middle of your your face or whatever, which you wouldn't do if you were seeing me, but you could do if you were seeing an image of me.
Mm.
So mostly I don't care about words. What I care about, and so I don't care about the word image, but what I want people to do is to recognize that most normal-ish people don't see images. They innerly see things.
I appreciate the clarification about that, because it reminds me of something that Thomas Metzinger once told me about, when he used to say that the self is an illusion. When he looks back at it, he often regrets it, and he doesn't. He believes he's wrong in certain ways, but also doesn't like the psychological impact it's had on certain people, because many philosophers and thinkers started to believe that certain abnormal mental phenomena that justified illusory selves almost explained normal selves, if I'm explaining that correctly. But he sort of didn't like that. Once he was at a lecture, and he noticed a lot of people from a psych ward had entered his lecture just to appreciate the fact that he would justify how many of us don't have a self. But it's almost like they didn't understand the nuance of what he was trying to say about certain human experiences. And it's easy for anyone to sort of fit into whatever we're talking about. So the same way you're talking about an image versus the actual experience of it, two people might not necessarily have that same first person subjective experience, but it might sound or seem similar when we describe it.
So that's an interesting story, and I got a couple of reactions to that. One is it is the case that whenever I describe inner phenomenon to somebody, the modal response to that is, oh yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. I know for a fact they don't know what the fuck I'm talking about. They couldn't possibly, but people believe that they do. So I'm on Metzger's side about that. I don't. And so that's one thing. Another thing is the self is a mentalism. And I think it's risky to delve into the mentalism world. So I don't know anything about selves. I doubt that if you ask me if I had to bet, like I'm at the gate, I'm at the pearly gates, and the question is, you can come in if you give me the correct answer, whether there is a self or not. And if you get the wrong answer, then you're going to spend the rest of your life in the nether regions. If I would say there probably is not a self. But I don't know the answer to that question. I would have preferred that St. Peter asked me if I knew the answer to that question, and I could confidently say no, then I could probably get in. But I don't know the answer. But the problem that he's telling you about is that if you define the self, then you get people who are into some kind of an argument about whether the self exists. And everybody's got a different definition of what the self is. If you try to define the self, you're in real trouble. I spent a quite number of years very early on in my career wrestling with this issue, trying to could I people wanted to tell me about themselves, and was that really true for most people? What that meant? And I think most people have stories about themselves, but they very rarely occur in inner experience.
Mm.
And so my work is to say, I would prefer to limit myself to talking about things that I know what I'm talking about, and the self is not one of them.
And the reason why that came to my mind as well, was everything about DES, or the way everything you're talking about, reminds me of a certain paper that Thomas wrote about mind wandering, and how he was sitting with two people, two professors, discussing the fact that every time you talk to them and you ask them exactly what are you thinking about right now, almost always people are incorrect.
People what?
People are incorrect usually when they're directly asked about that question, which is fascinating, because that is the main premise of this current talk, is this current subjective encounter with that moment. But when people try to recollect what they were talking about, more often than not, they're wrong. So I guess my question would be, how is DES different and almost more reliable?
So I agree with the premise of this question that people are mostly mistaken when they think about their own inner experience. So doubling back to one of your earlier questions, what is surprising about that? What is surprising to me about the work that I've done? That's one of them. The people, for the most part, don't know about their inner experience. I wouldn't have expected that, I don't think, 50 years ago. Now I think that's maybe the fundamental thing that I have established to my satisfaction is that people are largely mistaken about their own inner experience. And so the question of why is the question of armchair introspection. So the problem with armchair introspection is that it's an impossible task, because armchair introspection at its heart is something like, I'm going to ask myself the question, what's going on in my inner experience right now? But I'm going to rule out the fact that I'm asking myself the question, what's going on in inner experience right now, because that doesn't count. I'm looking for something beyond that. But the problem is that when you're asking yourself that question, there isn't anything beyond it. And so if you're really sort of honest about that, the answer to your question is either nothing is in my experience, or I'm asking myself the question, but I don't know anything at all about what my normal everyday inner experience is when I'm not asking myself that question. So I'm very critical of armchair introspection, including by philosophers who make their career on armchair introspection. I think it's very difficult to do. Let's put it that way. I do think that it's possible. So I think the adept meditators are armchair introspectors who have learned how to do it after 10,000 hours of trying
And do you
whatever
think
else they have to go through.
they successfully cracked that code? Do you think that
I
they
do.
reach a point where
I do.
they're really good at it?
But their inner experience is way different from everybody else's.
Mm.
But I didn't get to the answer to the
Sorry.
question is why. The second part of your question is, why is DES better? And the answer is, there's several reasons. One is it uses a beep, and people say, "Oh, it's the magic beep." Hurlburt thinks he's got a magic beeper, which he doesn't. But what the beep has characteristics which are entirely useful. One is it has a fast rise time. The beep goes from nothing to something within a few milliseconds, couple 700ths of a second, few milliseconds. It goes from something to nothing, and so it clearly defines a time. Now, when you hear the beep, there's a lot of processing that goes on. So that I'm not saying that you hear the beep exactly the way the beep is. I don't think that's true. Your brain, whatever, has to process that beep, but somewhere within, probably on the order of a quarter of a second or something like that, we have gone from nothing to something, and you said, "Yep, that's the beep." So that's one thing, fast rise time. The next thing is that the beep means one and only one thing. It means pay attention to my inner experience right now. Without having to ask the question, pay attention to what am I thinking about right now? It means, what am I thinking about right now? And we're going to have some practice, because I didn't say when back half an hour ago when I described the process, on the first day, you're not going to be very good at it. So then we're going to do it again. And you're still not going to be very good at it. And then we're going to do it again. And on the third day of it, then you might be pretty good at it. That is a fundamentally important thing, which I call the iterative process. I think you need that kind of stuff. You need to learn, whatever that means. I don't know what that means, but you need to acquire the skill of paying attention to what that is in your experience right then and nothing else. You got to know what experience is. You got to know what the beep means. It takes time, the skill. You got to acquire that skill. So the beep means pay attention to my inner experience right now and nothing else, and it happens immediately. So that's two things that makes my method, I think, more believable. And the third is, then you're going to tell me about it, and I'm pretty good at it. Listen, I'm pretty good at listening to what it is that you're telling me. I'm not perfect at it by any means, and I generally do these expositional interviews with co-interviewers, so that there's somebody else other than me who's listening to the same thing, asking the same kind of questions. And then we can agree with each other or disagree with each other. Or he can say, "Well, you got a blind spot there, Russ." And I can say, "Well, you're probably right about that. Why won't you ask that question?" Or whatever. So But you got to tell me about it. And the reason that that's important is that you have whatever presuppositions that you have about what your inner experience is, and you're going to tell me about your presuppositions probably rather than telling me about your inner experience.
Mm.
And my art, if you want to call it that, is to be sensitive to that and to be able to tell the difference between when somebody is telling me about their presuppositions and when they're telling me about their experience. And we can spend a whole interview talking about how I do that, but there's nothing magic about it. It is I know what people are sounding like when they're telling me about experience, and I know what people sound like when they're telling me about their presuppositions, and I try to get them to tell me when it sounds to me like they're talking about their experience.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a skill that is nurtured and eventually becomes something you can sort of master. And I remember writing a note when reading your work, and my note said that one second, let me just check. You've done a great way of almost countering subjective biases. You've put in these safeguards to assist to avoid things like memory interpretation and framing because of this very method you've just described. And I thought that was a brilliant way to bypass a lot of these issues that human thought generates.
I think that's exactly right. I would see it the other way around. What I would say is all those things that you mentioned, those are total risks. And so my method, from my perspective, is, well, what do you do to try to keep those risks under control? You use a beeper. You have interviews that happen very shortly after my expositional interviews have to be the same day or the next day. 24 hours it turns out to be sort of okay. I require that you write down something right immediately after the beep to minimize the memory, whatever. So all those things which you see are challenges to subjective reports, I see as challenges to subjective reports. And DES is nothing more than and nothing less than my attempt to try to keep those under control as
Yeah.
best I can.
And I think it's a great way to do that because you almost remove the thinking and you replace it with acting, or experience rather than someone thinking about the outcome or having this major cognitive thought process prior to it. It's more about that subjective phenomenal experience in the moment, which then begs the deepest question, which is fundamentally what this podcast is about. What, for decades, your work on DES has explained so many different mind phenomena. How and what do you think this could do? Sorry, what could this tell us about the mind body problem or this relationship between brain and experience? Do you think there's a mind body problem? And what do you think DES could provide us toward a solution?
So there's two things there. One is I want to push back a little bit on your summary before, because I don't think of inner experience as being subjective. I
Mm-hmm.
think inner experience is every bit as objective as external experience. It's private, which makes it problematic,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not subjective, I don't think. We can have a long conversation about that, but I
Wait,
just don't want to.
sorry, Russ. Before you move on from that. A question I had prior to that was the role of statistics in capturing that exact subjective experience. Because I know you wrote a textbook about that. Maybe it's best that you actually do explore that.
I have written a textbook about that, and that's sort of the the work that I do is fundamentally non-statistical. I do count things, but when I count things, I generally explicitly say I don't really care about how many of these things I get. I'm going to count them because I want to be able to say, well, Tev's got sort of a lot of this and not very much of that. And if you say things like that, then you're obligated to count because a lot and not very much is a county kind of a thing. And so I count. But I'm also acutely aware that if we sample together and we do 10 days of sampling, which is a lot from my point of view, at 6 samples a day, that's only 60 samples. And so the error bars around any frequency that I get are going to be fairly high. And so I'm not interested in statistical significance in the work that we're talking about here. I write a book. The whole book is about statistical significance, and I wrote that back in 1990 because I wanted to be taken seriously, and I knew that if I just eschewed statistics altogether, that people would think I was a soft-headed guy like anybody else interested in consciousness. So I said, well, I'll write a statistics book and be known as a statistics guy, and then they'll take me seriously in what I'm really interested in. That's so probably not a wise decision that I made, but that was a decision that I made. So I have written a statistic book. That's it over there, or over there, and it's
Look,
in the
I think that's
sixth edition now.
that's always a good approach because you want to be taken serious. Studying this subjective is never easy, and many people tend to disregard it in various unreasonable ways. But how do you think DES, or could you explain how DES bridges that gap between first person phenomenological experience versus third person objective experience?
So I think all experience is fundamentally first person,
Mm-hmm.
and we can try to abstract away the first personness of it and call it third person, but it never really is third person. So my counsel would be, well, let's get good at the first person, which I don't think very many people are. And so I think the reason that I rankle at the term subjective, I think, is that most people think that something that's done badly is subjective, and I just don't think that's necessarily true. I think you can help somebody become a pretty, what I would call, high fidelity observer of their own inner experience, or I prefer apprehender rather than observer because of the Cartesian stuff. But the I would say I think people can become people start out as not knowing what's going on in their inner experience, and after 5 or 8 days of sampling, they can come to be able to apprehend their inner experience as it actually occurs, and that makes it as objective as anything else in the world. It's private. It's only them that is seeing it or hearing it or whatever, but it's not just an opinion. It's so.
Well, Russ, that sort of gives us an idea of where your mind's at regarding the mind-body problem. But I asked you about that earlier. Do you mind defining? Do you think there's a mind-body problem? This relationship between brain and experience, and do you ever think that we could map inner experience onto neural correlates, or will some aspects always resist reduction?
Well, that's a good question. I have with some colleagues in Berlin and the UK. We have done a small study where we put people into the scanner, into an fMRI scanner, and let them do whatever it is that they wanted to do, and beep them every now and then took them out of the scanner and interviewed them the way I would generally interview them, and put them back in the scanner, and took them back out and interviewed them, and put them back in the scanner and took them back out of the interview. So we spent people in and out of the scanner over several weeks, many times in the scanner, to see whether we could find something of the correlates of inner experience. And I guess before I said that, one of the things that I didn't say when I was talking about inner speech back in the characteristics of inner speech, one of the findings and not surprising results to me of this scanner study, which my colleagues and I have written about, is that inner speech, as it naturally occurs, people going about their everyday life sometimes engages inner speaking and sometimes they don't. That is not the same thing as inner speech on demand. So almost all psychological studies of inner speech are on demand. So I say elephant, or say pencil, or recite this sentence or whatever. Or I'm interested in reading and I show you one word and then another word, and then 10 milliseconds later another word, or 100 milliseconds later another word, and then another word. That's just not you. I'm highly skeptical about whether you're going to learn anything about what is naturally occurring inner speaking. So if you want to find out about the answer to your question, the mind-body question, you have to put somebody into the scanner and wait around for until they happen to have inner speaking. And then if they do, then you might be able to look at a correlate between that and whatever was going on in their oxygen production in their brains or whatever. And so I think that's possible. And I think we did discover some things, one of them being inner speaking on demand is not the same thing as inner speech, as normal inner speaking. So I think it is possible to map something about inner experience into neural correlates. Whether I think that's going to be useful, I don't think I know the answer to that question. The temporal resolution of fMRI is still pretty slow. We're measuring in terms of seconds, and in the world of inner experience, a lot of stuff can go all over the place in a couple of seconds. So can we speed up fMRI? Maybe we can. I don't have a good prediction. I don't have a good prediction about that. And I'm not a fan of neural correlates in the sense that I think inner speaking is going to take place here and inner visualization is going to be here or whatever. I think the whole brain is involved all the time. Sometimes some more, some less. But but I don't really know. I don't really know the answer to that. What I do think I know about that is if you cared about the mind-body problem, then you should be really worried about things that are mentalisms, which is almost everything in the way people think about the mind-body problem, I'm afraid. But you should be scared of any theory that tries to link a mentalism to anything. And if you advance, as I would call it, advance beyond a mentalism to directly apprehended inner experience, then you've got your work cut out for you because it's hard work. The descriptive experience sampling is not an easy thing to do. You got to develop some skills, which is, sort of like developing skills of being a virtuoso violinist or whatever. You need practice in the practice room or wherever, instruction and whatever. And then you need enough of those people who to be good at it, at finding out what's actually in inner experience, which is a challenge, and then you can start to do some correlations. So one of the correlations, as Hurlburt would say in his textbook or something, you need hundreds of people to have a correlation that you can start to occur, because the error bars around the size of correlations are really pretty big when you've got just a few subjects. And the problem with DES is it's hard to get. In my lifetime, I have sampled with 500 or 1,000 people or something like that. It's 10 or 100 a year, not a good year. But
Russ, something I thought about when I read your work was, I thought about Benjamin Libet and I thought about his free will experiments. And I thought, what if you replace the beeper with a buzzer or a shock? And I'm talking within microseconds. Would this impact someone's experience, firstly? And what do you think about free will?
Well, I have toyed with reproducing some of Libet's experience and experiments is what I meant to say there. and I think there is some things to be learned there. So for example, I think does the name Maskelyne mean anything to you? He's the astronomer's assistant back in the day when we were talking about the personal equation. Does the personal equation mean anything to you? Mm-hmm. The personal equation came. There was a famous astronomer whose name I forget now. That's sort of weird because I remember Maskelyne's name, but the astronomer, the task was to mark transit times. So they got a clock, and the clock is ticking away, and we want to know when Mars passes through the meridian or whatever. And I'm not an astronomer, but basically, you're looking through a telescope. There's a uh, hair down the crosshair in the thing, and you want to know what time it is that Mars passes. And so Maskelyne is dutifully writing it down. And the way you do is you look at a clock, and the clock is saying, 10:06, '01, '02, '03, '04, and when the Mars passes the line, then you have counted those things, and you say it happened at 10:04.3 or whatever. And it turns out that there are huge individual differences on the order of seconds on the accuracy of those observations. And Maskelyne got himself fired because his observations didn't match up with the astronomer. And the astronomer was really a famous guy who's, I can't remember which one it is now, but that became known as the personal equation, and it has to do with mental processing of clocks and visual processing and how you get these things together. And those things, they do not obey the laws of physics. You would think that the mind was processing this and the visual processing this and the same, but it's not true. And so that's one of the things that I was influenced by, which is sort of the Libet experiment that I try to take that stuff seriously. So I understand when I said a minute ago, when I said what the beep happened in a couple of microseconds. Your experience doesn't happen in a couple of microseconds. It takes a while to process that. And so it could very well be that your processing of the beep takes this amount of time in processing, and a schizophrenic individual's takes a different amount of time and a different kind of processing. And so what turns out to be your reports of inner experience are really pretty much messed up by the processing of the beep. I think that's possible. I haven't, one of the many things that I have not explored much in depth, but I recognize it as an absolute possibility. I think it's a much smaller possibility than most other people, but it's something to be taken seriously. And in the world of schizophrenia, I think it might be a big deal. I think it might be several seconds, and that can explain things like how is it that a schizophrenic individual can think that the light that I turned on the light switch because the light came on. Well, if you've got your timing circuits wacky, so that the lighting coming on is experienced as being before the switching. If your time processing is that wacky, well, then you're self-theorizing about cause and effect gets wacky. But all of that is to say, I don't know most about what I'm talking about, other than I think it's possible to do this attending to whatever is apprehended carefully, and it's worth doing. But it could be that when people do it, and and there's a lot of people who are doing it, and they got better equipment than I have, and they're younger than I am, and whatever, that they would discover that there are some limitations, and those limitations might be more important than the method itself, more or less that in the same way as Van Leeuwenhoek, the microscope inventor, whatever, believed in animalcules and whatever else he believed in, which weren't true in the long haul. But the microscope has turned out to be a pretty important deal in the philosophy of science, or the science of biology, even though he was wrong about what he was looking at. And I think of DES as sort of the same way. DES is a tool. I believe that my career has demonstrated that it's possible to do it. People don't use it. It's sort of disappointing to me, but I think it's possible. And if we did it, it would revolutionize what we thought about crazy people and about mind body issues and about a lot of other,
Russ,
a lot of other things.
before we touch on those broader implications and future directions, but I wanted to find out, you briefly touched on this, but in philosophy, people often talk about whether we can truly know someone else's consciousness. And I believe that DES has a very intriguing approach toward explaining this phenomenon. Do you have a specific philosophical view on consciousness? For example, do you consider yourself to be someone who's more inclined to a version of illusionism, a version of emergentism? Do you have a certain view in philosophy, or for you is this just sort of a spectrum of experience that you're open to explore and dissect over time?
I do not have a view of consciousness. I
Oh, wow.
don't know what people mean by consciousness. I don't try to understand other people's consciousness. I don't try to understand my own consciousness. What I am interested in is what people direct apprehensions of their inner experiences. And I think it is possible to describe, to apprehend. For me, if I outfitted you with a beeper and we took, we did whatever we had to do to figure it out, I could find out something about, with pretty good fidelity, what is in Tevin's inner experience as he describes them at particular beeps. And that would probably have quite a bit to do with what is actually in his experience. It wouldn't be perfect, but it would be what I call high fidelity, probably. We haven't done it, so maybe it wouldn't work with him, but I that's as close as I can get to knowing about what's in somebody else's mind, which is to say, I don't know what's in Tevin's mind, but I think I could know about what's in his inner experience.
With that being said, Russ, let's move on to that deeper implication and future direction. How would DES inform clinical practice or therapy? And could it change how we understand or treat mental illness?
Yes, I think so. Hang on just a minute. Okay, I'm good. I had another appointment, but it's been canceled, so I'm in good shape.
Sorry, Russ. I didn't even check the time.
Yeah, so neither did I. So tell me again what your question is. Oh, how would it change?
I was saying, let's move on to these broader implications and future directions for DES. And for anyone watching or listening, I think it's a great way for potential researchers, philosophers, scientists, if they want to jump on board and maybe work on your work and take it further. How do you think DES informs clinical practice or therapy, and could it change how we understand and treat mental illness?
So I think there are fundamentally there are fun if you really take DES seriously, there would be fundamental shifts in almost everything that you do. So therapy, I'm a licensed psychologist. I don't practice at it, but I am a licensed psychologist. The therapy is basically, if I'm the therapist and you're the client, I'm supposed to set out to change you in some important way. That is not DES. DES is not a manipulative thing. DES is a let's discover Tevin the way he is, not let's try to make Tevin better or Tevin different or whatever. That's a hugely different deal from my point of view. And my guess is that for Tevin, it would be better for him. I don't really know because I'm an ignorant mortal, but the my guess is it is of more value for Tevin to know what his inner experience is than for someone to try to change his inner experience. That is, know thyself is probably a better maxim than change thyself. And that, of course, is fundamentally different from the whole psychotherapy mindset. Hugely different. And then I think I touched, as far as psychopathology is concerned, I think it probably, if you, I think a psychopathology science based on what on the characteristics of inner experience would probably be different from the science that we've got now. How that would be different, I don't know exactly, but I think people with psychological disturbances have messy inner experiences, and by messy, there are some people who just they they don't have their figure. The figure never gets to be clear for them for whatever reason. Either there's no figure at all, or they've got a sort of a cloudy figure, and it's not really clear. And I think those things are difficult for people. I think it's generally easier for people to be able to see clearly what they're looking at than to hear clearly what they're hearing. And it's an environment, whatever. And
Russ,
and for people to recognize their own inner experience with skill, so that they don't find their anger coming at them like by surprise out of the blue. They see the anger as it arises. They feel the anger as it arises when they're just a little bit angry, when they're still capable of doing something about it. But if they don't, if they can't apprehend that, then by the time their anger really shows up, that's too late for them.
do you see AI or machine learning helping us analyze DES data or even simulate inner experiences?
I don't know the answer to that. I am, and right now, actively involved in an AI simulated learning project that is trying to answer that question for DES. It's basically, can we use can we use AI to make a computer version of Hurlburt? And we're trying to figure out the answer to that. For better or for worse, I don't know whether it's a good thing to be doing that or a bad thing to be doing that. It seems like an inevitable thing to be doing, so I'm doing it. And
How
the
does
people that
one
I'm
do that,
working,
Russ?
well, one finds people who know how to do it, and then gives them all of your stuff, and then they report back. And so that's basically where we are. There is a group of people who I've given them. So I've got out on the web. Your readers probably ought to know about this, or your listeners probably ought to know about this. But I have on the web a, a whole series. I think there's 11 of them out now that are in DES investigations from beginning to end. From the first time I met the guy to all the interviews that I've had to what I've written about him, all that stuff is the videos are out on YouTube. And so I have a YouTube channel basically that puts all these things out there, including transcripts and commentary that I've written about the transcripts that I think people like you might be interested in reading about. All that stuff is there. And so in answer to your AI question, I said, well, I've given all this stuff to the AI people who know something about AI, and they say, you want to know something about what Hurlburt does. Well, this is what Hurlburt does. You got 100 hours of it. This is, figure it out and get back to me.
Yeah, I think that's such a great
sort of where
way
we are.
to get stuff done, because that amount of content is so useful for any sort of algorithm that can put this together into a much more solid summary or synopsis. Because with all that, by the way, I'll put a link to that, Russ, to your channel and to all this, to all these investigations and your papers. But if you could design the next generation of studies in this area, what questions about inner experience are you personally most eager to answer?
My guess is that the answer to that question is that it's the wrong question. And I don't presume to have a crystal ball that's any good. And I have personal examples of where my own crystal balls are terribly, terribly bad. So I shouldn't take this anything more than Russ's meanderings on whatever today is. But I think science has to get over the answering questions model. I don't think that's the right model. I think there's limitations in that. I think exploring phenomena is probably more useful than answering questions. That is a fundamentally different way of almost science. Everybody thinks of science as you ask a question and then try to answer the question. That is what for myself, I call validity-based thing. You have a theory and you try to validate the theory or whatever. And I think validity-based science is doomed. I don't know whether I'm right about that, but that's what I think. And I think the alternative to that is what I call fidelity-based science, where we're trying to find out about phenomena as they are. And it could very well be that if you had a mature fidelity-based science, then validity-based science would be a really good thing to do. But as it is, I think validity-based science is out over its skis, and it needs the corrective it needs is to recognize that it's quite possibly, substantially misguided. And so we just need to roll back the interest in answering particular questions and to try to just describe phenomena and discover phenomena the way they are. The problem is the questions are always backwards looking. You know, you got a question, you're trying to validate something. That's a rear view mirror question. Validating questions is always looking in the rear view mirror. And until you got a really good view of what's back there, until you really know what's back there, then probably a good idea to look out the windshield.
Russ, after all your years of research, what do you think is the most common misconception people have about their own experience?
That they know what it is.
Could you elaborate on that? Oh, even though you already have, but just to round this up for people, just so they get a clear picture of exactly what your work has done.
Maybe this is my first answer was a little glib or whatever, but I think people have presuppositions about their own inner experience. And when you ask them about their inner experience, they tell you what they presuppositionally know about their inner experience. And I think people's presuppositions are delusions. And so they tell you about the results of their delusions. And like all delusions, they believe they're telling you about the truth. But it's not the case.
Do you think there's a way
that's the fundamental thing. The fundamental deal is if everybody recognized that they were really delusional, sometimes big delusions, sometimes little delusions, but the fundamental part of the human condition is basically delusional, the world would be a different place. Republicans wouldn't be arguing with the Democrats, and if they all recognized that they were really both of them fucked up and delusional and at the core. They pretend that they know what they're talking about and they're the good guy and that they know the right thing and everybody else knows the wrong thing, when it's probably true that they're both delusional.
Well, Russ, it's such a pleasure and honor for me to chat to you. Such a big fan of your work, been following it for many years, and hope you continue to succeed and produce such quality work and research. Is there anything about your work that you feel I haven't touched on or that you would like to reiterate and make sure people really take home?
Yes, I would say one more thing about it, and that is that it's genuinely interesting. I've been doing the same work for 50 years, and it's at least as interesting to me now as it was 50 years ago. Everybody is different. Getting people to be able to tell you about their own inner experience, because you have to wade through their own presuppositions and distortions and whatever. It's totally challenging. And it's a totally interesting and challenging thing for me personally to do. It's not going to work for me. It's the privilege of trying to have somebody tell me about what's actually their fundamental private experience, which is pretty cool.
I mean, that's beautiful, Russ. The fact that you still enjoy it after all these years and still so passionate about it, you can see it by the way you talk about it. And if anyone wants to reach out, I'll put links to your website, put links to all the work you've done. From my side, thank you so much for all the incredible work. I appreciate it very much.
Well, you're welcome. And I would say just in one last thing is that the website that I put out there, that is my version of phenomenon oriented. I'm not trying to answer any questions in that. I'm trying to tell you this is what Ryan's inner experience was, and this is what Lena's experience was, and this is what Mel's experience was, and this is what Carrie's inner experience was, and this is how I got there, and this is most of the time I've had co-investigators with me, and this is what I thought about the co-investigators' questions, and this is what they thought about my questions, and it's the nuts and bolts of it.
Russ, before we close, something else I thought about before we chat was, I remember your book with Eric Schwitzgebel, the two of you, because I've had Eric on the show. I know you guys did that sort of a back and forth discussion. When people look at your work, read through it, discuss it, dissect it, when viewers listen to this or watch this, what do you think of the questions they will ask you or sort of debate with you and retaliate in terms of things that you most commonly encounter when discussing these views? So if you had to almost preemptively defend yourself, what would you say?
Well, I would say I did a pretty good job of answering that question in this interview. So the questions that you asked are pretty much the same kind of questions that I get, and I answered them the way that I would generally ask them.
Mm.
And so the general thing is I agree with all the criticisms. Everybody's criticism from Eric's on up. All those criticisms are valid. I have done I can sleep easily at night saying I've done the best that I can do to live in a world where I take those criticisms seriously. That doesn't mean that I am good at it even, or that I'm right about it or anything, and I'm pretty comfortable with that. But I have taken them seriously.
Mm.
And I would say, if you're going to mention Schwitzgebel's book, I've got that book. I think is sort of a model of good communication. That of people taking each other seriously and not trying to talk past each other,
Yeah.
which I think is sort of the fundamentally interestingest thing to do. I think that's
Mm.
that's a good book from the standpoint of modeling that. I think Eric and I did a good book.
Yeah, I think
did that well.
that's something that's very incredible to watch, is two people actually discuss something very engagingly, intellectually, and with so much respect. Russ, if there's a postdoc student, professor, anyone, a scholar watching this, trying to enter this field, assist with DS, propagate it, move it forward, what advice would you give them? Is there any sort of direction you'd like this to go in the future?
I don't know that I got a good answer to that. What I would say is my book with Eric, I think is something about engagement. My book with Marco Caracciolo is an extension of that, but in some ways better than the Eric book. The book with Eric basically is we had conversations back and forth, and then as the result of those conversations, we refined for each other what it was we're trying to do, and then eventually put those out there about each one. That was the book with Eric, which I thought was a good book. The book with Marco is basically it's the whole conversations. There's no distillation involved. It's the whole deal out there that so you can it's basically he wrote me an email. He's a guy that I'd never met. He wrote me an email. I responded. He wrote me back another email and I responded, and we went back and forth. And so it's basically a collection of emails between him and me about these topics with no filtering hardly at all. So it's sort of like an epistolary novel, except it's in a real life real deal. And then the interviews that I've put out are sort of the next step in that. The interviews are just the basic thing, the whole deal. So the Eric is sort of the homogenized whole deal, and the Marco thing is the whole deal from one perspective, and then the interviews are the whole deal, really from everything with the video and the word for word and all the whole deal. So if you really want to know what I think about things, that's the transition of it.
Mm. Well,
and I think, rightly or wrongly, I think we need to do more of the kinds of science that is in the kind of interviews where we're just trying to discover phenomena, trying to discover the difficulties and limitations and blind spots and whatever. There are, so for your philosophical friends, the people who might be watching this, in those interviews, there are philosophical questions raised, particularly in the no, I take it back. I think they're all the way through. But there are philosophical debates in, I don't know, I'd have to look and see what my chapters are here. I don't actually remember what. But your readers might want to know, or you can filter this out or whatever.
Yeah, I think they'll be excited to hear this. So I think they'll want to know exactly which aspects they'd find most intriguing. This is very much a philosophical / scientific podcast. So the audience are probably waiting for something like this.
So I'll give you a little bit of a guided thing.
Mm-hmm.
Part 8, VII 8, Gabriel was a college senior interested in philosophy. And so there are discussions of philosophical issues that go along with his interest in philosophical questions. But the advantage of that is that they're asked in the context of a particular sample. This is a sample, and what is this? How should I take this? How should I understand that, or whatever? That's part 8. Part 10. A guy came to me and said, "I think I know how to do DES better than you can, and better than you do, and so let me teach you some stuff about that." And I said, "Okay." And so we enlisted a woman, Mel May, and we interviewed, we co-interviewed her. And in the context of that, there are decided backs and forth between the person whose name is Julian Bass Kruger. Julian and I debated each other about what you really could and couldn't do, and ask about inner experience and whatever. So those debates are raw and opinionated, and I guess you could say, but all based on what we could say about Mel's experience. So they're the the one notch more raw, I guess. So the Marco book is a little bit raw. The Caracello book is pretty raw, and the Mel deal is very raw. And then the next one I think they might find interesting, if they got that far, is part 11, which is Carrie. And Carrie turns out to be Mel's friend. And the backstory there is Mel turns out to have almost no inner experience. By chance, nobody knew this going in, but she ended up having relatively little inner experience and thought that's the way everybody else was, because everybody thinks that everybody else is just like them. But in the course of the interviewing, she became convinced that maybe she's not that similar, because I would say, well, this isn't what I usually see, but let's see. So she recruited a friend of hers to be a subject, and then the three of us, which would be Julian and me and Mel, were co-interviews with Carrie. And Carrie, it turns out, was quite a bit different from Mel, which isn't too surprising because everybody's different from everybody, and Mel is pretty unusual in the first place. So Mel and Carrie are very, very different. But then you get a chance to see how that plays out.
Mm. And Russ, is that malleable? Do you find that once the realization is there that, let's say, Mel doesn't have this experience, is this something that is trainable, or is that permanent?
Inner experience can change and can change dramatically and I would say miraculously. I've seen a few miracles along the way, one of which I've told in the story of Fran. I've told fairly frequently as a inner experience that I think changes dramatically over the course of uh, of her sampling with me.
Mm.
And I don't have time. We don't have time to tell that story again, but I've told it recently on a podcast. I can give you the link to that podcast. It's also in my several of my books. I think my second book, my 1993 book, tells the story of Fran, and I've told it in journal
I'll
articles as
definitely
well.
put links to those, Russ. Russ, it's such a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me. Any final words? Anything from your side that you feel you haven't touched on? You good?
I think I'm good. I've enjoyed the conversation. I thought the questions were good, and good luck.